And then, of course, the South China Sea part, whereby we know that conversation already in this part of the world, what's happening with the South China Sea is the one road that turns from this side all the way through Indian Ocean, the Black Sea, and so on and so forth, also to the west of Europe as well. Now, there has been a bit of a challenge there because the South China Sea delay, right, for 2.5 years has slowed the machine down, right? So China's growth is slowing down because of that as well. China's trade is been slow because of that as well. That's why they were very upset about it with the South China Sea conclusions when the International Tribunal award the winning side to Philippines. Philippines, you are correct, China should not be there, and this and that. Right, so there's been a bit of a challenge there in that regime. The only challenge around the Belt Road Initiative is that the Chinese know that they can't lead the world without being totally recognized. Right, so what they did was that instead of saying that they lead the Belt Road Initiative, they are actually saying that they are proposing the Belt Road Initiative. In other words, they give you a white sheet of paper. Say, what can we do together? Right? Okay, when you ask the Western world a white sheet of paper, I always ask the New Zealand government people, I say, would you be doing your job without a contract? You won't be, right? You always want a contract. Now, the Chinese are giving you a white sheet of paper that doesn't say it's a contract. It only says what should we be writing on it. Now, that worries Western countries big time. And actually that worries ASEAN at that time as well, like thinking that you can write what you want at the end of the day. When we got all the money, because you are big and powerful, you can actually sort of bully us onto it, right? So that leads to the big disputes around the South China Sea as well. And a lot of understanding about things and that. Now, whether the Belt Road Initiative is a dominance thing or not is unknown, but China is very stressful about its growth. And China needs to grow because it's very uneven here. But at the same time, they are talking about Belt Road Initiative being policy-driven, being facilities, connectivity, like the Bandung and Jakarta thing, right? And unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people bond, right? Hopefully, they are not talking about Chinese going anywhere they want, because that's a worry. Right, if the floodgate opens to Chinese and Indians, we have about 3-point-something billion people around in those two countries. In New Zealand, I always joke, I say, if you try to understand how the China and India think, and even Indonesia, right? Think about the fact that for every 601 person in one room, 601 person in one room, there's only going to be one Kiwi. The other 300 is Chinese, there's another 300 Indians. Right, so the proportion is 1 to 300, so try to understand the difference in size. Right, even from where you sit in Indonesia is actually 1 to 5. Right, so the how many of you here, let's say 30 of you here, right, in the same room, the proportion of Chinese will be about 150 of them and 150% of Indians as well. Right, so they are even bigger, so you have a lot of people here, but we're talking about even bigger ones over at the other side, which is China and India, right? Which means that they have a lot of stress. Big doesn't mean good. Big means resourceful, but big also means there's a lot of stress moving forward. You need food, right? Indians, I don't know about Indians' consumption pattern about chicken, but Chinese love chickens, right? If you actually have a poor and rich Chinese balance each other out, every 10 days you eat one chicken. You need about 1.3 billion chicken every 10 days. How to grow chickens that fast? Right? And if you want to make it halal, even worse. Right? And all sorts of things, right? So there is a bit of a challenge there. Once I ask that question, everyone say, wow, okay, never mind, thank you, it's time for lunch. Right? Okay, because that's the kind of perplexing kind of challenge there, right? Now, just a quick few slides. I feel a bit obligated to describe to you a bit of the New Zealand context. Instead of showing some nice pictures that you should have a holiday in New Zealand if you haven't been there, right? New Zealand does have a very sort of long-standing relationship with ASEAN, right? Not as tight as it should be, I must say, but there is something there, right? Okay, and it's called the New Zealand Inc. ASEAN strategy. And in that strategy, let's not these are all, wording, but let's jump into this ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, so-called the ANSFEDA, which is the first comprehensive free trade agreement signed by ASEAN, and it's a major milestone for New Zealand's trade negotiations. Right, and ANSFEDA is now being renegotiated for extension. It's not an issue, right? The question is, what do we want to do more in the ANSFEDA? Now then, of course, New Zealand also have other arrangements like P4 with Brunei and Singapore, and New Zealand, Singapore closer economic partnership. The enhanced one just got signed last month. New Zealand, Thailand, CEP, New Zealand, Malaysia, FTA. Now, some of these things can be confused with the ANSFEDA, but there's quite a sort of a bit of overlap here and there with products and services, but also there are other added values of some of the bilaterals over the multilaterals and vice versa. Well, we haven't seen anything directly with Indonesia yet, but I guess if New Zealand do something with Indonesia, Indonesia might be thinking, you bully me again. Right, okay, it's a big and small kind of challenge, right, as I mentioned previously. Now, New Zealand exports to ASEAN, right, top 4 areas, no surprise there: dairy, birds' eggs, natural honey, edible products, 40 over 50%, right? It's slowly diversifying, as in, it comes down from 55% to 49 to 43. Right? Even though the volumes has slightly tapered off in the last 2 years, it has gone back up again in 2017. I ran out of time to include 2017 data here. It has slightly bounced back again after a good year in 2014. And of course, we are talking about meat and wood and everything else, right? The top 4 product areas constitute about 60% of New Zealand exports, right, into ASEAN. Now, New Zealand imports from ASEAN in the same region, right? Vehicles, mineral fuels, electrical machinery, and machineries and appliances and everything, right? I assure my Kiwi colleagues saying that I'm sure it's not nuclear reactors that we are talking about here, right? When they trade with ASEAN, right? Very, very unusual, because New Zealand is nuclear free, so they stay away from nuclear discussion. So this is just part of the classification. Yeah, but again, look, again, quite diversified. In fact, we import a lot more of different things from ASEAN relative to, to China, in fact. Okay. New Zealand ASEAN trade and investment was worth about $13 billion in 2014. It's trying to go up to double by 2025. The last time I checked is that it's actually growing well. So it might actually be more than $27 billion by 2025. It's actually going to be much way ahead of that one. Right? In New Zealand, we are also in conversations around the ASEAN 2025 strategy, right? That we are trying to work closer with ASEAN. If you think about it this way, Indonesia is actually the closest neighbor to New Zealand other than Australia. Right? Even though I have to go past Singapore again. Right, the flights go to Singapore and then I have to come down to Jakarta. Actually, I was literally flying past Bali. I was thinking, why don't you just stop me there? Right, Denpasar, right? It actually flew past Denpasar, the area, and basically landed up in Singapore, and I have to come down to Jakarta. So, there's a lot more to be done there, given especially about flights and more increased flights and other things. Now, let me jump back to some of the things that is happening, right, in the ASEAN context broadly as well, right? And some of these examples has got things to do with Indonesia, of what is being proposed. Now, ASEAN as a group, and I don't mind saying this to in this room as well. I mean, ASEAN countries love each other, right? And I was with Yenti, and Yenti is in that group of all the ASEAN guys, and in front of ASEAN guys being one of the ASEANs, I can tell you that we actually love each other but hate each other, right? Okay, and that's because there is a certain element of the fact that the countries are so diverse in ASEAN, right? Okay, the people, the languages, and everything that, if we try to work as a group as ASEAN, there's a lot of value outside. Okay. But ASEAN also has a habit of accidentally having a lot of internal competition. Right? So I remember one quick story. I was hosting one of the Thai Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? One of the deputy secretary in one of my Cape Hat, right? So I'm running the center. So I brought one of through the Royal Thai Embassy in Wellington. So I brought him in, the Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was doing some presentations in Auckland and Wellington. And then he presents what? Thailand 4.0. Okay, that sounds familiar, right? But every country has a 4.0. Okay, and so he presented 4.0 and said EEC is a great thing and this and that. So 2 weeks ago I actually visited EEC and asked some questions about, you know, what they are doing around it, around the focus that they are after in the region. Now, so after the presentation, 2 other High Commissioners came to me, right? The Malaysia High Com in Wellington, right, Michu, and the Vietnamese, right, Ambassador Tong, right, Mark Tong. He called himself Mark, right? He has a Western name, just to make it easier because people can't pronounce his name in the Western country. So the 2 of them came to me and say, Prof, what do you think? Thailand 4.0, we have Malaysia 4.0 too. Right? And I can't see what's the difference between Malaysia and Vietnam. Right? The 2 of them, right, asked me that they can't see a difference between their 4.0 and the Thailand 4.0 strategy. Right? And then, of course, that begs the question, right? Everyone in every country in ASEAN seems to be aiming for the same thing. Okay? And if ASEAN wants to work as a group, we must have that conversation to say, do we really all need to do 4.0? Right? Or somebody is better off with services, right? Okay, somebody is better off with the training, right? Right? Maybe in certain partnerships, of course, in some ways we want to be secure within the country, each individual country. But as a group, I think when we work in partnership, we should be doing different things so that as a group it's stronger, rather than everyone is doing 4.0 and saying that this is how we will interact with New Zealand, we want 4.0. But if Malaysia shows up with 4.0, Thailand shows up with 4.0, Vietnam shows up with 4.0, I mean, there's only, New Zealand can only pick one, we can't pick all 3, we are so small, right? So there's a bit of a challenge where you pitch a story like that outside as well, right? But in response to some of these real challenges that I've mentioned, right, and we can have a broader discussion for the rest of the session as well after I go through a few more slides here. Countries are responding slightly differently, but also overlapping again in some of the responses. For example, Philippines, what I have in front of us, Philippines always track doing business in Philippines index. Now, World Bank has such an index. Every year they classify the ease of doing business, right? Just type in Google ease of doing business. It will give you an index comparing all the countries of how to, you know, how does business actually engage in your country, for example, in terms of the kind of time that it takes to start a company, the kind of time that you take to open a factory, and all sorts of things there, right? And some of these countries like India, right, and also the Philippines in this particular example, is trying to play along that how open you are or how fast you are to respond to foreign investment and trade. Right, so some countries are saying that let's aim at some of these index and push it, right, so that to outsiders we look like we are actually more open, right, and that's crucial in some cases. But to create more openness is quite important in the ASEAN context. In fact, just on that alone, I think in the last corruption index, ASEAN didn't do well, right? Some of the countries actually apparently become more corrupted. I don't know how it works, right? Okay, but somehow the index actually gone worse. Oh, there's the man, right? It's not by design, it's by accident, that this so happens to be the example, right? That I didn't visit Indonesia, so I have to stick his face here, so that's a different story. Indonesia eases foreign ownership curbs in big bank liberalization, right? And it's always a developing country challenge, right? And of course, moving forward is still a challenge. Why? Right? Reflect on the model whereby, say, for example, in the Chinese and Indian context, and in a lot of Asian country context, even in Singapore in the older days, When you're a foreign company, when you want to set up business in Singapore, for example, you need to form a joint venture. It's compulsory. You can't own everything. You have to bring your Singaporean company along, or you have to partner with a Singaporean company that we choose. And normally the government chooses them, right? And that's because of learning, right? So your partnership can be useful because you can actually learn from your foreign investor, right? For example, the US company or German company or Japan company, you partner an Indonesian company with them, and then the Indonesian company learns something, right? So I noticed the word that I use learn, not steal, right? Well, we steal also, right? By learning, right? Or learning by stealing. At the same time, now Indonesia is foreign ownership. Now this one allows foreign companies to be a bit more certain, because in the past it's always going to be the case that everything has to be minority. That means you can't own more than 50%, because then you are the bigger partner. But now I think not just in some industries in Indonesia, but also in the most part of Southeast Asia, right, you are allowed to own more than 50% of a foreign investment. Okay, in fact, in some industries as well, you are allowed to own almost like the larger majority as well. Okay, and that's quite important to encourage, because you must remember, foreign players, foreign companies are always very scared, very worried. They invest in Indonesia, they doesn't know anything at all. Invest in Jakarta, they doesn't know anything. If you're lucky, they know Bahasa, but other than that, totally don't understand. Because the mentality is always going to put, say, a New Zealand model into Jakarta. Right, let's have a New Zealand model into Jakarta. Okay, and then basically it doesn't work, and then they, oh, that's bad, and then they go and tell everyone it's bad, right, and that's the bad news, right? They try to impose that as well. Okay, and having talk about imposition, there's always a local requirement, right? Every time I visit Lanzhou University in the west of China, right, the student rep always reminds me, Prof, we sleep at lunchtime, right? Our lunchtime needs to be longer. I say, what do you mean you sleep at lunchtime? Do you think you'll wake up? You say, don't worry, we will always wake up on time. All right? Just give us 1 hour lunch and 1 hour's nap. All right? So basically, I always give 2 hours lunchtime in that part of that China. And apparently, Shanghai don't sleep, right? I go to Shanghai to, say, do a guest lecture or do an executive course for a year, not for a year, for a day, right? Nobody asks me for napping time. They say, keep going, man. Keep going. If since you are here, you might as well keep talking, right? Don't waste. Okay, that's what their thinking is, right? And that's Shanghai, and the other part of the China just say, look, I want 2 hours break. If you don't give me, I'm going to do a riot and protest, right? That's what they do as well. Very, very different within one country as well. So there are some kind of local requirements that I need to, adhere to when I travel to different countries. Then, of course, once you have, more openness and foreign participation, then you want more investment to come in. Of course, Philippines has been pushing that, and I think Myanmar is also pushing that as well in the last few months as well, right? You will read quite a lot of those in that particular case, right? Improve access to resources, that will be you, right? Indonesia has got some challenges around finance for SMEs, small, medium enterprises, and that's quite normal for any country. And it's good for Indonesia to think about that and start to push out on financing a bit better for smaller and medium enterprises. After all, Google was once upon a time small, right? Now we understand big companies like Microsoft and Google and everything, but we must remember once upon a time they were small, right? Microsoft dropped the ball, allowed Google to grow, right? I don't know whether it's in your generation yet again, but some of you must have heard about this company called Netscape, right? You have, okay? Netscape, so I know your age already, right? Okay, so Netscape, right? Netscape was actually going to be the first Internet Explorer equivalent, or Google, Microsoft, Explorer equivalent, 1995. Right? They just say we are going to be changing the internet world. I mean, internet only shows up in the early 1990s, by the way, right? For those who were not born at that time, and basically that guys were shouting like we are going to change the world. Yeah, Microsoft doesn't want you to change their world, right? So they actually decimate Netscape communicator at that time, totally dead. for shouting too loud. Google is very quiet. Those two young guys, and they are still young, I think they are in the early 40s or mid 40s by now, I think mid 40s by now. You know, they hide themselves in the garage to create that Google at that time. Very quiet about it. Don't shout and let Bill Gates know about it, right? And they actually grow fast enough. Once they actually hit on the public forum, the public offering, it's too late. Microsoft never get a chance to attack it. Right? And since then, Google has been powerful and Microsoft just let it be. I mean, there's nothing Microsoft can do about those two companies like Apple and Google, right? Okay. And so we must recognize that SMEs do grow in some cases, so we have to give some finance to support it as well. Right? Government spending is always quite important in our part of the world, in ASEAN, so that's quite easy to appreciate this one, as in government spending actually helps. But once governments overspend it, then it actually doesn't make the economy stronger, because that's almost like half a fake economy, right? Right? Because the businesses are not coming in, but yet the government is the big customer of everything. They buy everything and this and that. So it's there needs to be a bit of balance between government spending and the economic boost, right? And from where I sit in New Zealand, for example, a lot of people doesn't understand that in ASEAN, right, or in Indonesia, the government and the businesses are actually side by side, sometimes even as one. Okay, where New Zealand sits, the government don't talk to business, the business too scared to talk to business, the business too scared to tell the government what they do. Otherwise, they try to help you. And when they help you, sometimes trouble comes. Right? Okay, so they are very distant from each other. Now, Singapore push out to drive local economy, right, through consumption. And that's what China is also doing, right, all the time. Okay, can you make, do you know how much savings there are in markets such as China? In the banks, there's about 28 trillion US dollars of savings in the bank. Right? People are not spending money, or the older generation are not spending money. They are saving everything in the bank and refusing to buy the best products. Right? Just do cheap groceries. Okay, so much money inside there that the government has to force them to buy things. The only problem is that when they buy things, they go around buying houses from somewhere else, right? Making the capital flight thing, right? So a lot of Chinese actually buy houses in New Zealand and Australia and Canada and Greece and everywhere. So money starts to go out, right? And that's why the Chinese government also create a new regime whereby money cannot go out without certain permission. Right? I'm sure by now, I think some of your Indonesian banks will have linkages with the Chinese bank to watch how much money comes through from both sides. And if both sides don't find a person, or if the Chinese banks actually let one of those guys to bring through, say, 2 billion rupiah, right, without permission, right? Somebody in that bank, in the Chinese bank, is going to jail for that kind of things, right? So there's a certain arrangement at the country level that the banks all have to talk and say, so and so bring in so much money. How did the person have so much money? Right? Because of the corruption issues, that also because some of these corrupt people are, shipping money out of China for that same reason as well. Okay. Now, of course, to foster transparent business environment, especially around IP, right, is quite critical in that sense that, in this part of the world. And I must say that, in every part of the world, everyone is copying from each other, like, who is not learning technology from each other, who is not, re-engineering, right? Japan likes to use the word called, we found the practice called re-engineering, right? In a nutshell, re-engineering means you give me your products, I open the products up, and then assemble it back, and then learn how you assemble it, and I do it differently, then it becomes mine, right? In fact, it's another way to broadly say it's called stealing. Stealing in a different way, as long as you are not protected. Okay? Because why? It's easy to protect the IP of a product. It's very hard to protect the process. Right? There are multiple paths to this office. This morning, say for example, there's a protest going on. We have to find different ways to come in, right? To meet each other here. Okay? Now, these multiple ways means that as a business, I cannot protect or I cannot have IP on all these ways to come here. I only can protect the way that I come here this morning. You use another way to arrive at the same spot. That's yours, that's not mine. So I can't protect that. Which means that, you know, many companies can do the same thing like this clicker, right? But I can protect, I can actually have the same product as my IP. But then the only problem is that the process of putting it together is not protected, right? And everyone observed that. The developed countries or the developing countries all have the same rules. So it's very hard to protect IP, right? Not just in this part of the world, but every part of the world as well. Now, Vietnam decided that there are potential that once they go into a lot of these trade agreements, there is a problem. A lot of Vietnamese companies and small, medium enterprises are not ready. Okay? New Zealand is never worried. You know why? Because New Zealand has got more sheep and cows than humans. Okay? So we are not worried that competition comes in. Now, do we have a Walmart in Indonesia? No, not yet. What's your biggest supermarket chain? Huh? What's your biggest supermarket chain? Huh? Transmart, okay. And is Indonesian owned? Okay. Okay, right. Okay, and there are countries like this that has got the largest supermarket chain as the local player, right? But if you think about it this way, Walmart has been in Germany. It's a very big market. Walmart got beaten up by the local player, Asda, right? Has to leave. Okay, Walmart was in China, got beaten up by Vanguard and a few others, left, and 3 years later come back again. Why? China is too attractive, we have to come back. Right? So they got beaten up in China and then left for 3 years to you know, treat the wounds, and then learn a few tricks about the Chinese and then basically come back again to China. Now, there are a lot of these kind of things happening. Why? Because some of these trade agreements that we are talking about tends to benefit the big businesses, right? I mean, the governments might earn a few bits and pieces, but then it's actually the big business that earns big time from any free trade agreements because they have volume, they have size. And New Zealand is in every trade agreement. You know why? Because it's small. It's good to be there. And I always joke, because Walmart doesn't want to come to New Zealand because it's too small. Right, so we are not worried about big companies going to New Zealand, but then when Vietnam opens up, right, Walmart and all those big giants will be there, because Vietnam has got also half the, slightly less than half of Indonesia's population at about 100 million, right, and that's quite a substantial market that is relatively untapped, right, for many, many multinationals. Not the easiest market, of course, right, but also relatively untapped there. Okay, so they are trying to develop some competition among themselves so that they warm up to potential foreign threats, as in foreign companies coming in. That's why we ask the question, are we always ready for globalization? A lot of local companies are not, right, are not. Because very big multinationals, they will always give the government a bit of like, hey, you know, I'm going to invest 100 million, talk to me, right, show me some love. Right, I will give you all my $100 million of love. How about something in return, right? And so they always have that kind of bargaining power that is very unusual, uncharacteristics of smaller enterprises. But if your smaller enterprises are not there, you get whacked by the Netscape, right? Right? Because you will never be able to fight, like a Netscape will never be able to fight like against Microsoft at the time. Okay, until you become like a Google size, then you can pick up a big fight with Microsoft, if even possible at all. Then, of course, we know that state enterprises is always quite crucial, right, in the sense that, you know, some of these transitions, like Myanmar's case, or even, you know, in Singapore, I think they use a lot of these state-owned enterprises or state-linked enterprises to fund for other businesses first. So what they have in Singapore is basically state-owned and state-linked will do the front, right, and then small, medium enterprises will follow through at the same time in a joint venture or coalition group, so that they can actually sort of tackle issues at the same time. Then, of course, local champions needs to be given a bit of break as well. And so in this case, you know, I think it's Singapore as well, or some not just in Singapore, but also a couple of other countries in ASEAN as well, you know, do a bit of corporate tax cut, right, to encourage them to push harder. You'll be surprised that small, medium enterprises doesn't really have much budget to travel, for example, right, and to buy things that are not as essential, right, not like big companies. You know, and for some countries, it might be worthwhile to have actually a branding strategy as well. So Vietnam has that, Myanmar is looking into it, Cambodia has that branding around their rice, right? I think Laos as well. So it might be important, right? Because, you know, I always have jasmine rice, Thailand jasmine rice in New Zealand. Right? But of course, I also know that most of them are made in Australia. Right? They are not really the Thai jasmine rice. Okay? The real Thai jasmine rice, I have it when I'm actually in the Thai embassy over there. They actually import the real Thai jasmine rice into the Thai embassy over there. I think they do it in every country. But, you know, if you talk about Thai jasmine rice, everyone knows about it. Right? It's actually quite popular, and it's actually good to have it that way, that certain products or services you promote as your country strategy, right? And when you have a certain image out there, it's actually quite different, okay? Especially for your smaller, medium enterprises. Okay, here is the single rice brand that I've just mentioned, a collective approach to things. In New Zealand, we also have a bit of that as well. The only problem is that in New Zealand's case, when we had the, I believe it's the mussels group, when they come together, right, or the seafood group they call it, when they come together, they were great in China for the first 1 year, and then after 1 year, when competition heats up in China, they start to fight among each other, right, even though they are part of a bigger group, right? So there's a bit of a challenge of cooperation within a larger group as well. Right, that's Singapore, you know, supporting internationalization, although I must say that in markets such as Indonesia, there is a lot of domestic market there to be reach out, right? The rising middle income group as well in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, I think the, in terms of the population age, is not an issue yet. Not like Japan or China, right? Whereby, you know, you have the aging population issue already, right? In ASEAN as a group, most of the countries have relatively very big young population, right? Which means that you have a long time to go. Right, any views on this one? Where you see it will be the greatest impact from the trade war between the China and the US? Any views? Is Indonesia affected yet? Some, right? Is Indonesia happy that they are fighting, or not as happy? or like to watch without having to pay for a ticket? Any effect that you see yet in Indonesia about this fight between them? Bits and pieces, right? Okay, there are some industries that will benefit, right? There are some industries that will get hurt, right? Like car manufacturing might be bad news. Some areas of food and agriculture might be bad news because they fight. Steel might be bad news because they fight. Now the latest one is the thing called rare earth. Right? Rare earth is one of those, you know, commodity or minerals or whatever material that they call it, that is on earth, of course, that is actually mostly about China, right? If China doesn't want to deal with that with the US, I think US is going to get a big hit from that one as well. Not to say the Indians are after the US. US is still thinking about after Mexico, you know, and then US is also looking at who else bullies them. Which is good, because recently they were talking about who is manipulating their currency. Right? I'm sure, you know, they will be looking at Indonesia very closely on that one, right? About how big is your rupiah compared to the US dollars, does it move or not? Even though I told my Kiwi friends, I say I'm a millionaire next week, because, you know, 1 million rupiah is not a lot of money in New Zealand either, so you know, I hold millions of dollars or millions of rupiah here, so that's good. Now, so there's a big fight among those two, and China all of a sudden becomes like the world trade leader in the sense that they are leading the world to try not to destroy the World Trade Organization, right? US is in the process of trying to decimate the World Trade Organization that it is actually a central part of, right? Which is a challenge on its own. So we'll see where this heads us to. Now, ASEAN always has a big role to play. ASEAN is somewhere in the middle of everything. Its geographical location is also crossed out for a lot of, because it's somewhere around a few oceans as well. You know, its position in South China Sea is beside the Indian Ocean, and its connection between, like I say, you know, on top of it is China, right? On the left-hand side, if you look at the world map, is India, right? And then below it, of course, you have the Australia's group as well, right? And of course, on the right-hand side, if you go a bit further, is the Americas, right? Latin America and Canada and Mexico and the US as well. So it geographically is also centrally located, right? And of course, this thing comes out. Initially, the Indo-Pacific strategy came out of nowhere. They call it the Quad, right? The Quad was used, you know, Australia, US, Japan, and so on, and they were just coming together and try to ask questions of China's presence around the One Belt, One Road. Then subsequently, it's good that ASEAN took over that thinking process and said, look, we do the ASEAN centrality, and Indonesia has since publicly said that they want to be a leader in that space, right? And in fact, you know, I was telling Yanti this morning that, you know, the Indonesian ambassador to in New Zealand, right, Tantowi, some of you might know who is Tantowi. So Tantowi, you know, is organizing a Pacific Exposition Conference on the 12th to the 14th of July, right? So I'm a big supporter of that one, and I'll be there as well, right? In Auckland, in New Zealand, around Indonesia's taking the lead around the area of, well, I mean, not on the place, but, you know, basically taking the lead to facilitate ASEAN trade and investment and tourism and human-to-human change and all sorts of things that probably the Belt Road also doing. So the linkage between ASEAN and the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand, right? So Indonesia, at least in that part of the world, Tantowi is pitching that Indonesia will hold on to that centrality position in that space to the Pacific, right? Which is also quite well aligned with what comes out from here, right? In Jakarta, around Indonesia, wants ASEAN to be the axis of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and says, you know, in some of the fine prints here and in a few other public forums that Indonesia will seek to take the lead on that one. Then, of course, because of the fact that most of ASEAN is connected by land and so on and so forth, right, Thailand calls for ASEAN to unite around special economic zones, right? These are called special economic zones, whereby there is, you know, sort of certain free trade across borders. I don't know how that works yet. It probably works in ASEAN because ASEAN has, you know, the three pillars, and including the AEC, right, the ASEAN Economic Community. So it's easier to work out how, because we are connected by land, most of ASEAN, then it's easier to work out how that works. But also outside ASEAN, right, it's interesting, Myanmar has a special economic zone with China, right? Even though China is not part of ASEAN, but actually there's a certain border whereby they have a special economic zone with China. I don't know how that works. I haven't got time to investigate that one. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at Mekong. You know where's Mekong, right? Right, so Mekong is the intersection between three countries. Okay, the Golden Triangle. Okay, so I was standing on the Thai side. I was watching the Cambodia side and the Myanmar thing. Right? Okay, so it's a triangle that is divided by the river, by the Mekong River. So maybe there's some barbed wire underneath it, I don't know, but basically, you know, it cuts through the river as a certain border, right? Okay, and the border going by boat, I actually get to see that as well. I mean, it's quite chaotic there, but never mind. So on the Thailand side, when I was standing there, when I was watching overseas on the other side to Cambodia, some things drew to my attention. And something that is written in Mandarin. You know what it says? It says that this is the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone. Right, okay? So there is a special, you know, Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone that is actually owned by the Chinese on Cambodia land, right? Which is interesting, right? And in fact, when I investigate, apparently the Chinese lease that plot of land that is at that corner, and basically starts to have gambling dens, casinos. Of course, in China, which is further down the river, right, Yunnan and all these other places, you cannot gamble, but you can actually gamble or do a bit of casinoing, right, in Cambodia, and that's the interesting one. And it's written in Mandarin, so from that side I saw, hey, what's up, man? Then basically I zoom in and basically saw the Mandarin characters, and in fact, I look closer, there's also some English words as well over there, but the Mandarin one was just obvious. And when you see the Mandarin words there, you know the Chinese are here, right, by default, okay? So there is a bit of that. ASEAN as a collective, and I've already sort of mentioned that earlier on, is that there's always a challenge around, when the ASEAN opens up to each other, it becomes a big market. So Indonesia becomes a big market for all the other countries in ASEAN, right? And so is Vietnam, and so is a bit of Philippines, and definitely also for Thailand and Myanmar as well, right? When it actually takes off. And of course, because of that, it's easier for us to think, hey, if these countries are linked, it's easier to do business there. But bear in mind, the ASEAN concept is not just about doing business with each other. It's around, as a collective, what is the approach beyond ASEAN, right? And so we have to have that competition, right, which is a short term for, this is competition, this is supposed to be collaboration, right, or cooperation, and then this is competition. So they have this word called competition, right, which is actually collaboration plus competition at the same time. Now we compete because we also want to be stronger. Competition is not necessarily bad, right? It's bad for some businesses because they are not competitive. But competition drives the strongest one to stand out, right? Your strongest supermarket will be able to fend off Walmart. That would be great. You don't want your competitors to, when Walmart comes in, all of a sudden, all just lie down and say, look, whatever you want, right? Okay, no way, right? So basically, it's good to have some very strong competition and competitors that is coming out from Jakarta or Indonesia on its own, right? And Southeast Asia has got a lot more global investment, even though global investment has been sliding, but Southeast Asia's fair share has been going up as well, very significant. All of a sudden, it becomes a very neutral place for any activities, right? Especially around China, US fighting, and Indian is an unknown. European Union is dying and not growing, struggling with Brexit. Latin America is not safe enough to be around, right, for many countries. And so if you look around, there's not much help there. I'm not saying that ASEAN is not good, but you are the best thing out of the worst bunch. But I'm saying that, when everyone looks for opportunities, people will say that, look, this is probably diverse enough, but still not complicated enough, and there's a lot of potential in some of these markets here, right? And as I mentioned, right, sometimes it's not about the tariffs anymore, because most of the understanding about certain tariffs is driven down to close to zero. So basically, we are talking about non-tariff barriers that we create to say that, look, I mentioned before, if you want to produce phones here, you need to buy Indonesia chips. Now, that is a non-tariff barriers, right? Okay, because it's not related. You have to pay for this, the right to be able to do it. Otherwise, or you have to get an Indonesia company to fix this. Otherwise, you are not coming, right? That is actually a barrier in itself. And so as a group, I think I want to encourage us to think like that. And of course, there's also parts of the Indonesia contribution around the centrality as well, to which I want to promote, as well as Indonesia is like a sleeping giant in Asia, right? Okay, I hope you don't mind me calling sleeping giant, but from where I sit, I think Indonesia is still a sleeping giant, right? In making less noise than the other giant, which is called India. India is making noise everywhere, right? But it's very sleepy. Right, but Indonesia actually is more active than that, but definitely stick to the tradition of being a bit more quiet for like ASEAN countries. Most of the ASEAN countries are relatively quiet in the global arena, and so there's a lot more to be done in that space as well. So with that, I just give you a couple of slides about what we do there. So as a Southeast Asia Center, I help New Zealanders to get a bit more understanding about the Asia-Pacific Rim, especially New Zealand and ASEAN. So I work with the New Zealand government on all things, and New Zealand businesses as well. I run workshops for them and so on and so forth. A bit of the 4 university efforts as well, because the center is housed within 4 universities, although mainly in Victoria, but the ownership, right, the bosses, there are 4 universities there, and there's only about 8 universities in New Zealand, the 4 biggest ones. Now, and there's a lot of linkages that we do establish here, so we actually send not just students here, but businesses here as well, and also, we also host quite a lot of different events back in New Zealand as well. I'm involved in some of these public service sectors classes, and of course we do English language training at the Victoria University as well. We host, like I hosted the Thailand Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and all sorts of different kind of things that we do. It's just to try to tie the links a bit closer than to just do normal student exchange, right? And the universities are good at those things. We can do student exchange. The university are also good in saying, oh, let's have the academics change, like 2 months. But there's very little to talk about all these other things, right, beyond students and staff, academic staff, around policy linkages, around policy collaboration, around getting business to tie up with other businesses in Indonesia or visits and to understand each other, not just that, right? So sometimes I do bring Indonesian counterparts into New Zealand. Like I say, it's probably cheaper, right? To bring Indonesian counterparts to New Zealand just to get them to understand what Indonesia is like, right? Without sending all of them here. I mean, there's not many of them, but without sending them here, it's easier for them to actually understand directly from Indonesia into New Zealand as well. So I do quite a bit of those things as well, which includes business engagement, workshops, SMEs, young entrepreneurs, right? And then of course some projects that has got outputs that is relatively important for small, medium enterprises. And then on the education space, fellowships. Right, so the next tranche of CAPE fellowships might see an Indonesian there. The last one didn't have one. Market insights, international student sharing knowledge, right? School partnerships program. So as we speak, there's about 6 Indonesian teachers in New Zealand, right? So it's a partnership program that we partner six Kiwi or New Zealand primary. That is primary school. Sorry. That's primary school or secondary school. Now I'm trying to recollect. I think it's primary school, right? So primary school, 6 primary schools from New Zealand to partner with 6 Indonesia primary schools. Okay, so we have we have funded both the teachers or both ends to travel to each other and stay there for about 3 weeks in the homestay, right? And then go to the school and understand the student, exchange and do a bit of that knowledge, and then build a program for the 2 years. To how to exchange, to try to understand Indonesia a bit more, try to get them to pick up basic on the bahasa and so on, and try to get the Indonesian teachers to do similar things back in New Zealand, right? So that there's some linkages going on there for the next 2 years to see how it goes, right? Because I think everything that we know is easy to listen to some things, but it's always good to build a connection, and then basically they can actually go through certain things together, and those kind of connection tends to be a bit more lasting and tighter, right, than to have just a proper speech as well. So I do quite a bit of those as well. And with that, I thank you very much for bearing me with all the ASEAN languages here. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Now we proceed to our next agenda, which is Q&A session. For the first session, we would like to have 3 questions from the floor, or at least 4 questions. And then the next session will be coming from our streaming participants. There are quite a bunch of people there, and there are already 4 questions, which appears. For the first one, please mention your name, sir, and from which unit you are coming from. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frau Chair. My name is Pasroni. I come from the Law and Legislation Department of State Secretariat. I want to express my satisfaction for your explanation of your document today. And I just to ask you this still related to global sharing, special on the role of the China, as you said, as you mentioned. I want to ask, just want to ask your opinion concerning about the world trade between U.S. and China. As you know that the president of U.S., Mr. Trump, is imposed by high tariffs for all the product of China. In this case, maybe you can to keep our explanation. What is the most implication to Indonesia? And then, is it the tariff imposed by Trump? It is limited in all product of the China. I mean, all the product is all the infrastructure of the China around China, or also include the outside of China. Maybe. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question. So I think we will go through another, if they don't strike a deal between China and US, they will probably do it by products. So one product after another, right? So you hit me on my left face, I give you a punch on the right face. Right? And that's what they've been doing for the last almost 2 years now, and they'll be probably doing it again every single time. Right? And you will notice that in the last 2 years, to be honest, I mean, for the most part of what they decide to do with each other is mostly a threat, right? A threat that most part doesn't get materialized. So none of these really big tariffs that they are talking about is actually happening. Right? And if it actually happens, it will probably take a bit of time to actually warm it up to make it happen. But they always say, look, $200 billion, US hits a big one on China. China say, I will retaliate with 60 billion of mine, and then basically, and then Trump will say, look, that's fine, let me think about it, and then he just go home and rest, right? It doesn't do anything, and then the next day he just talk about Mexico. Let me go and deal with Mexico first, and I'll come back to the Chinese, right? And he has been doing that left, right, center, right? If you actually track him over time, right, none of these things really get, sort of pull the trigger, right? It's actually seeing who is going to blink first, right? Both of them staring at each other, eye to eye. Who is going to make a tweet and basically just lost it, because US will never want to commit or to admit that basically they are a bit worried about China, right? But they are worried about China because, look at the way they attack the technology, right? China is number one on a few technological space, right? Artificial intelligence, they are definitely out there already, or up there already. Solar energy, already in control, literally, already ahead of everyone else. And that's because, I mean, I don't know how far you think ahead in Indonesia, but definitely Chinese think about 50 years down the road. As I said, 1.3 billion chickens in every 10 days does require you to plan long term. You can't just plan for a year or two, it won't last long. Right? So the US will never admit that they will be beaten up, but China will never respond and say that, look, we are scared of you, right? So these things will keep attacking, but it won't be the whole of China or all the industries. It will be one by one. And at the end of the day, when you go one from to the other, the previous one just kept quiet, so it didn't happen again. It happens quite a lot throughout the last 2 years. So I'm still sure that they are not good friends, but I'm also sure that they are not big enemies either. They are just asking the questions of who is standing on whose side. And that's the next big one that will come through, right? Who is with the US and who is with the Chinese and so on? Who is whose friend?
Do you think it's also my way to give it some context in military action? Is it possible in some part of the world?
Can you repeat your question again? I didn't get the first part.
Is it possible maybe the world trade is causing
Don't get your question, so.
Actually, Mr. Barastoni asked whether there military war, like with the case of Germany or...
Okay, so military war.
Yep.
Okay, so it won't be, right? This one won't be a war about military, so, because, you know, if it's about military, they would have done it already by now, right? US doesn't take much time to attack other countries, right? The only challenge here is that Russia is also close to China, and US doesn't want Russia to be close to China, right, at the same time. Okay, because those two countries can be quite a handful for US on military. Right? I don't know whether how much you know the statistics about Chinese army and Chinese weapons, and there are heaps of them around. There are probably more army than the population of New Zealand alone, right? So basically it won't be happening, the war won't be happening, and also bear in mind, where is the war?
But China to set up military base, like in
Yeah. Yeah, so my question is, okay, if US goes to war with China, where is the war going to happen? Is it going to happen on Chinese land or US land? Because they are very far away from each other, right? And even 5 years ago, there was a report coming out from Bloomberg saying that, you know, the Chinese already got long-term missiles that can hunt down one of those, you know, warships anyway from miles out. So a warship costs about $2 to $3 billion US. So the US won't be sending their warships near China in the real war, because you can't even get close to, high cost of engagement. That's why I asked the question, if they want to have war, are we talking about war in the US or war in China or South China Sea? US is too far away to pick up a fight with China in the South China Sea. High cost, yeah. They won't make it, man. So.
Next question. I'll be first, and then Faisal, and then do we have any clarity on this side, or we will have the ladies at the back, so 4 questions.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Adi from Bureau for Foreign Chemical Cooperation. One thing that I want to ask from your presentation today, it seems like the world today is very gloomy and very dark in the direction because of the impact of the trade between the US and the China. If ASEAN is the key to minimize the impact from this trade war, I would like to know from your perspective what kind of the most essential issue from ASEAN internally that needs to be addressed in order to come as one power to at least minimize the impact of this situation. Because previously you said that we have Vietnam 4.0, and then we have Singapore 4.0, and so on and so on. I think since we have the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015, it seems like it's still ineffective because ASEAN states still has to deal with the internal problem. So in this section, I would like to know what is the most essential part that we need to solve so that we could go broader step after this one. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So you have got the answer to your question. So the answer to your question is, why is the AEC not effective? Right? You got to address that one, because I have been hearing the last few years that AEC is not effective, and from where I sit, I don't hear much about AEC either. Right? And I suspect that when I talk to ASEAN different countries will tell me AEC, 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 but if you ask them exactly what you are doing in AEC, Thailand will tell me EEC. Right? So they will be talking about EEC, which is actually Thailand, which is not AEC, which is ASEAN. Right? So there's a kind of catch there, right? So why would we not try to see what we can do in AEC? Because AEC is almost like a European Union, except making that mistakes with the common currency maybe. Let's throw away the common currency issue first. But if you think about EU, why is the EU attractive in the first place, right? The EU is attractive because it does make EU a very big market, right? How to make ASEAN a big market? Indonesia is a big market, Vietnam is a big market, Thailand is a big market. Now, but that's where you see it, right? But from the US, what do they see? They don't see Singapore as a big market. They don't see Laos as a big market. They don't see Cambodia as a big market. They see Indonesia as a big market, but it's not the primary of their concern. The primary of the concern is India after China, right? And the primary of the concern is to still be friends with the EU if they can, and the UK as well. Right, so you do have to try to phrase out exactly what you want to do in AEC, and in particular around all these the strength, right? The only picture that is a problem now is that everyone is doing 4.0. I mean, you know, Germany also had 4.0 many years ago, right? And if you go out and start to, you know, pick up a big fight over 4.0 with all these other countries like Japan will tell you we have 6.0 by now, right? And so it's very, very difficult to say let's negotiate with Japan, given that this is our negotiation 4.0. It's not true, right? It's not true anymore. And in fact, if you think about 4.0, some of these nations are well above that as well. Singapore is definitely already gone, right? Come and go. And trust me, your 4.0 won't last very long if you're growing at this speed. Your 4.0 may last you for 1-2 years. 1-2 years later on, you have to move on to 5.0 or something else. You know, and that's the kind of challenge that ASEAN has, right? It's actually growing very fast. You have to recognize that what actually will keep you going for 10 years, right? Whether it's Indonesia or whether it's Thailand or so on and so forth, the 4.0 won't hold for too long within some of your countries at all, not even close. 2 years later, you will say 5.0, and then after that, you will be saying, oh, actually, we are too expensive to manufacture. We will have to do a service, right? So you hop onto something else, right? And